This is Duke University.
Born in Brooklyn, New York, to two Southerners, Gloria and Charlie Laughinghouse from Greenville, North Carolina. And they came up, migrated to Brooklyn, New York in the 1950s, late 40s, 50s, and grew up there. And working class parents. My dad made it to 8th grade, mom made it till 11th. She worked as a domestic, cleaning rich white folks' homes, dentists, doctors' homes. My dad was a factory worker and worked 2, 3, 4, 5 other jobs on the side. And I learned a lot since I used to go to work with him. Matter of fact, oftentimes went to that factory with him and began to get a sense of what factory life was like. And he encouraged us to hit the books hard. My mother and dad encouraged us to hit the books hard, and which we did. And they gave us little extra assignments. We weren't able to sit around and read comic books and play all day. We were told to hit the libraries, read, hit the museums. New York's full of great museums. And all of that seemed exciting to me since she let us travel on the trains of New York, the subway trains, by ourselves. And I also worked quite a few jobs as a farrier, a factory worker, janitor. This is all between the age of, 13 and about 16, 17. Later on, hung out at Stuyvesant High School, Peter Stuyvesant High School in Lower Manhattan. It was a pretty activist sort of group there. Hung out with them, participated in the student mobilization against the war in the late 1960s and 70s. Joined the African American Society. This is during the 1960s and 70s, during the time of the Freedom Movement, Black Power movement. And our ears are always attuned to what folks were saying, what Stokely Carmichael, later on known as Kwame Ture, and Dr. King, and certainly Malcolm X, since I only lived 10 blocks away from where Malcolm used to speak at the Audubon Ballroom on 168th and St. Nicholas Avenue. So all of this was catching a young man's attention. Sound pretty exciting to me, with the problems we were having in our community. At that time, hospital workers were organizing, teachers were going on strike. We have powerful teachers unions in New York. There were struggles going on for black studies at the City University of New York. There was the black arts movement developing with Sonia Sanchez, Amira Baraka, and a host of other great artists. And all of this captured my attention. I began floating around and going to some of these activities, and it was a great political awakening for a young teenager. I got to North Carolina by virtue of meeting and learning about the Charlotte 3 and the Wilmington 10. Dr. Jim Grant was one of the Charlotte 3, and as you know, Ben Chavis was one of the leaders of the Wilmington 10, and used to write him while he was in jail during the 70s. While Ben and Jim were in jail, built a great relationship with Jim Grant, and he recruited me along with Irv Joyner while I was at Rutgers University to come work on a project called the Student Mobilization Project, where students would come south and work on major civil rights issues down here in North Carolina. And my grandmother was just down the road there in Greenville, so I came to Raleigh, and later on, after I graduated from Rutgers Law School, had an opportunity to meet Sandy Smith and a host of other members from the Workers' Viewpoint organization.
Can you just go back and explain what the Charlotte 3 and the Wilmington 10 are?
Charlotte 3, these were freedom fighters, civil rights activists right here in North Carolina. The Charlotte 3 were a group of young people who at that time were challenging segregated facilities and segregated Jim Crow, apartheid here in North Carolina. And they were convicted for burning down the Lazy Bee horse stable, where they denied African Americans the right to participate or enjoy the services riding horses there. The Wilmington 10, these were political activists, again, challenging, they had a long history of challenging Jim Crow segregation here in North Carolina. And 10 folks, Ann Shepard, Turner, Ben Chavis, and a host of other young folks were arrested again. They were accused of shooting back when they were shot at and from a church down there in Wilmington. And they too were all imprisoned for their activities. They were like political prisoners. So there was a big movement that was developed by the I think it was called the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, led by Angela Davis and a host of other folks. I'm trying to remember her name, Charlene Mitchell, and a host of other activists and longtime freedom fighters.
So what was it about the Charlotte 3 and the Wilmington 10 that made you decide to come down to North Carolina?
The question of political repression. Was very familiar with it in New York City, where I recall the police throwing kids who were activists off the top of some of those tall buildings and getting away with it. I recall the police disrupting some of our youth community meetings when we were organizing regarding the police response to working class and black kids in the communities I grew up in, Brooklyn and Manhattan. So I saw a connection between the political repression of Jim Grant and the Charlotte 3 and Ben Chavis and the Wilmington 10, and knew that this was something very important, to support other struggles against government repression.
When did you start working for Black Workers for Justice?
Never worked for Black Workers for Justice. I don't get paid for Black Workers for Justice. I am one of the founding members of Black Workers for Justice. After the Greensboro massacre, there was such a chill in terms of organizing. Ran into Jim Grant again at Farm Worker Legal Services of North Carolina and Stephen Edelstein. And one of the things that Jim and I did when we finished our work every day, because see, my experience has always been as an organizer, I never got paid to do organizing. Basically, it was something I did after work on a volunteer basis. There was some real commitment beyond getting paid to doing this work. So Jim Grant and I, whenever we clicked off for work at 5 or 6, we would go through some of these rural counties, I don't know, about 14, 15 of them. We'd start organizing grassroots community groups in Hamlet, North Carolina, in Martin County, in Duplin County, in Faison. We'd have meetings in the funeral homes, and some people were afraid to have them in their churches because of the repression and the racist character of some of these leaders in these towns. So we began organizing grassroots community organizations. I think Jim and I must have organized in a period of a few years at least 14 of these organizations. And while we were organizing, we ran into a good friend of ours, Saladin Muhammad, that we had known from the African Liberation Support work that we had done back in the 70s. And we began doing what most organizers do. When you see other advanced experienced organizers and veteran freedom fighters, people who have experience in the Black liberation movement, you sit down and you talk and you figure out how you can work together. And Saladin was working at that time along with Abner Berry, a longtime veteran freedom fighter. He's in history books, Abner Berry, also known as Brother Babatunde, and Naima Muhammad. And they were working on pulling together some women who were struggling against sex and race discrimination at Kmart and Rocky Mount. And they were forming this organization called Black Workers for Justice at Kmart. That was in December 1981. And no, it was probably a little earlier, but it was in 1981. And he called upon me and others to help support that fight. So at that time, Jim Grant and I were building this huge workers' assembly of grassroots groups. 200-300 people from 14 counties attended. And we invited the organizers from Black Workers for Justice at Kmart to come to and speak out at this workers' assembly, which we held in Martin County. That was 1981. and they spoke. And we continued to talk about the need to organize black workers. As we continued to organize, and I continued my conversations along with Saladin and some of the other workers in this assembly, we said we really needed to form not a workplace organization, but a broader organization of black working people so that we could better organize for power in the workplaces and communities.
You mentioned it a little bit. Can you talk more about what was happening at Kmart?
Well, what was going on in Kmart was what was happening in many eastern, North Carolina workplaces, or probably for that matter, most workplaces in the South, where workers don't have unions. They're oftentimes the victim of racism, sexism, and just unfair treatment. So the struggle in Kmart was a struggle to empower the workers in that workplace by organizing a workplace committee where they could file petitions, bring their issues to other organizations and churches like the NAACP and some of the powerful churches in Rocky Mount, and try to rally the community to help alter the balance of power in that workplace so that workers could have their issues addressed. As one of the co-founders, we also formed a group that worked on building our first newsletter in 1983. This is all tying in all these issues and the fight for Dr. King. We founded Justice Speaks newsletter, which later on in 1985 became Justice Speaks newspaper. It raised up all these issues. We got workers to write articles on these community struggles, workplace struggles, challenging the racism and the job discrimination and the need for unions to come south. Matter of fact, one of our first newspapers put out the call to organize the South. Today we hear a lot of discussion about the AFL-CIO passing a resolution at its national convention about creative ways to begin to organize the South. Black Groups for Justice has always tried to make that call to come up with creative ways to organize what we call pre-majority unions. These are unions that may not have collective bargaining rights or have a contract or go through a union election, but yet they have a workplace committee. And we began organizing workplace committees. But we also understood in these workplaces that women had their own unique special oppression going on, not only in the workplace, but in the community. So somewhere in around 1986, we developed what we call the Women's Commission and a trade union commission. Can you imagine a small organization of hundreds of black workers organizing their own trade union commission? It's not a question of helping them. I think it's a question of how do we empower everyday workers to be their leaders of their own causes. I don't think men can help lead women in the struggle against patriarchy and sexism and chauvinism. The women themselves have to lead themselves. Similarly, workers have to be empowered, and you have to help make sure you nurture their leadership capacity and skills in order for them to take on these challenges. I don't think we're just trying to, help pull workers out of one hole. We're trying to empower them to continue to fight for, the things that they need in their day-to-day lives in their workplace and communities. So our whole piece was how do we get support for the workers' struggle, but the workers would lead themselves.
Produced by Duke University.